last segment is one that's a little bit more in depth. It's in the weeds. That doesn't mean it's boring. It just means you got to sit back. So if you got something playing in the background, pause it. If you are in another room right now and you're letting your phone play, come back closer to the phone. I want to ask you a question. It's going to sound so basic in theory. How important do you think winning is to recruiting? How much do these things correlate? On-field results to recruiting. And within the context of recruiting, what are your standards? So you define which program you're a fan of. And then let's ask what your standards are. I'll circle back around to that at the end. This is that whole chicken and egg thing, by the way. This is where we're going. That's the road down which we're going here. So there are many words that are used to describe recruiting classes. You could say, we signed a terrible class. Okay, we're not going to worry about that so much tonight. But you could say, we signed a good class, we signed a great class, we signed an elite class. Unfortunately, some amongst us find those terms interchangeable. They are anything but, friends. They're not interchangeable. So Bud Elliott, I call him Budrick, but on the street you may know him as Bud Elliott. He wrote a really good feature on 247sports.com today. It's still there. It's either on the front page or just scroll a little bit and you'll find it. But he was essentially asking, taking every top 25 recruiting class in the early signing period era, so 2018 to 2021. And he was trying to look for a correlation between the minimum number of wins you need to have on the field to end up landing an elite class or a top 10 class or a top 25 class, different tiers there. So this was interesting to me because I always find the recruiting class to be this evergreen beacon of optimism. What I mean by that, and you know good and well if you live on message boards that you've read these things 100 times each way. If you're having a good season, the talk is we're about to springboard in recruiting because of this thing. We're going to ride this wave of momentum on the field to a really good national signing day and beyond. Exponential are the results from this on-field effort leading to the recruiting boom, leading to then more on-field results. Well, then also you see the other side. You see having poor results on the field, and then you go to the message board, and no one's really worried about how the season's going. It's off the rails. What we're worried about is this recruiting class that if we can secure, will end up turning this around for us. And it's very rare that you find a program of any level of stability to where the season's going bad and everyone's lost hope in recruiting. Now, it never, well, let me not say never. Sometimes it doesn't work out the way you want it to, but now I go back to what Bud wrote today. So we're looking for this correlation here. And what he found was not overly shocking, but it did go a long way in validating what a lot of us already were thinking about the structure of college football right now. I don't know how unique it is to right now. But let me ask you this. So thinking about the number of wins in a year that you think is required if you're going to sign a top 10 class, let's say. There was wide variance. There was no variance, though, if you're going to sign a number 1 or number 2 class. So you hear a lot of times, this is where terms and words are important. You hear a lot of times coaches say, we signed a really good class. Well, that's great. What are your standards? Are your standards to be really good, or do you fancy yourself a college football playoff contending program? Because if you fancy yourself a college football playoff contending program or a championship contending program, you know who you got to beat. You got to beat Bama. If it's not them, it's going to be Ohio State. If it's not them, it's going to be Clemson. If it's not them, it's going to be OU or Georgia. You know the kind of programs you're going to have to beat. Where are those programs recruiting? Well, with very few exceptions, they're recruiting 1-2 every year, like Bama, Ohio State. You see, sure enough, Jesse's showing you right now, the 2021 composite team rankings. It was Ohio State looking at one point like they were going to have the greatest class in history, and then they couldn't get it because Bama had the greatest class in history. And it's going to be that way every year because there's LSU, there's Georgia, there's Clemson. But looking at that 1-2 spot, there is no variance there whatsoever. No one, at least in this recent era, has finished with 8 wins or fewer on the field and then all of a sudden landed number 1 or number 2 in the recruiting rankings. So you got to be doing it on the field to land 1-2. But what about 3 through 10? Because that's where things change fairly drastically. Then all of a sudden, you got a much higher percentage of programs that have won 8 games, 7 games, 6 games, but still managed to finish top 10. Here was the really fascinating part that, again, I don't think is shocking, but it validates a lot of what we think. There was, I think, how many were there? So, but here it is. Every top 10 class following an 8-win or fewer season had a head coach that was in his first 3 years. That lends credence to the grace period theory. So basically what he's saying there is any program that won 8 games or fewer, but then they were still able to land a top 10 class, it was a new head coach. And so what do we always say around here? We're saying it about Jeff Collins, like we say it with every coach that is 1 or 2 or 3 years in, you still got a grace period. Because you can still go out on the trail and you can sell families and you can sell kids on the concept that I inherited a dumpster fire, I can't do anything about it. The first order of business was put out the fire. Then get the dumpster out of the alley, and then let's start refurbishing everything. We need you to help us do that. Don't worry about what the record is right now, because by the time you get here, we'll be turning things around, and with players like you, we won't have results like those anymore. Well, that only lasts so long. And then there's this critical juncture, this transition period to where you can no longer afford to win 8 games or fewer and still hope to finish in the top 10. The perfect example, Bud pointed it out, he is dead on the money. The perfect example of that happening in real time was Tom Herman. Tom Herman, at a certain point at Texas, hit the juncture. It was this past year. Because the previous cycle, they were nothing to write home about on the field, but they still finished number 8 in the overall team recruiting rankings. But then, in this last cycle, still wasn't getting the job done on the field, and you heard the negative. You felt that negative recruiting happening in real time. We were talking about it on Late Kick in real time. And all of a sudden then they're in the mid to low teens and Herman gets axed because at a certain point no one's buying it anymore. I mean, it was crystal clear this year. No one was buying what Tom Herman was selling. In fact, they were buying what opposing coaching staffs were selling, and that was Tom Herman is going nowhere. That thing at Texas is stuck in the mud. It's not going anywhere. You're spinning your wheels, and they are too. If you hop on by default, you're not going anywhere. Look at all the elite recruits that have come in. Look at how few NFL draft picks are going out. Do not associate yourself, especially if you got an offer from us at Oklahoma or from us at Alabama or Ohio State. Everyone came and poached everyone out of Texas. And so that's the critical juncture. Who fits that description right now? Look around. Because I think I named Jeff Collins, but also there are some interesting names, really interesting names when you look coast to coast. Some are high profile, some are not, where they're entering that critical juncture. Haven't gotten the results on the field yet, still been able to recruit okay, but now if we fancy ourselves an elite championship contender, something's got to happen. And here's what the something is. Because a lot of teams out there are capable of recruiting 3 through 10 right now. Is anyone else out there who's not already hanging out in that club? I could take Texas A&M as a perfect example. Is A&M capable of going from recruiting in the, let's say, the average 5 to 6 range to recruiting in the 1 to 2 range? You'd think that doesn't sound like there's that big a difference. In this day and age, it's a huge difference. That's why when a coach steps to the podium on National Signing Day and says, we signed a really good program, we signed a top 10 program, I don't care. It's great. It looks good on the resume. It sells to the boosters. I don't really care. Unless you fancy yourself an 8.5 win program, 9-win program. If you fancy yourself a championship caliber team, I don't want you finishing 8th or 9th. There's as big a gap between the first class in America and the 9th class in America as there is between 9 and like 50. I mean, that's just the reality right now. Don't quote me on that. Don't pull out the calculator, okay? That's a guesstimation. But when you see the results on the field, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There are a lot of top 10 average finishers that got splattered this last year by Bama and Ohio State. So just keep that in mind.